Hello, today I'd like to show you how I simply sash some 5-inch squares. So I'm not actually going to alter the 5-inch squares, I've just got squares here and I'm going to put what we call sashing in between. I have actually done a simple pattern, I've done quite a few patterns, they're available to purchase and download on my website. This is a 5-inch, I have done quite a lot of 5-inch square patterns, and this one is just simply called 5-inch squares, sashed squares, sorry. And without altering the 5-inch squares, but just sewing, so I'm not sure how well you can see this, but there's a little strip in between each square and then a little tiny square at each intersection. So the strip in between is the sashing and the little square in between is the sashing posts. So, and I often put the posts in because it helps keep everything lined up and it's easier to put together at the end. So I'll just show you how I do this. There's a couple of different ways. You can just join a whole long row of strips and little squares to go in between, and some squares and sashes in a row, but I like to attach my sashings to my squares, or they could be of course pieced blocks. I would do the same thing for that. So because I'm using 5-inch squares, I found that I quite like a 1.5-inch finished sashing strip. So I'm going to cut my strip. So I'm going to sash my squares today with some white fabric. My sample or my pattern is very dark, but I'm going to do something a little bit lighter and brighter this time. So I'm going to cut using my board to help me line up my ruler, I'm going to cut my sashing pieces. Now I've cut my strip off the fabric already that's 2 inches wide because I want it to finish at 1.5 inches. So I'm just going to trim off the end. I've got it folded over in half so it's double. Just trim off the end, and then I'm going to come along 5 inches using the markings on my board, and I'm going to cut. Now there'll be 5 inches because my squares are 5 inches. So they need to be the same size as your square, so, or if you're using a piece block, whatever it is in there. So I would come along and just cut this whole strip into 5-inch by 2-inch strips so that they're ready to use. And I would need of course a few more. I'd work out how many strips I need before I started. And then my sashing posts, that's the little squares that go in between where these intersect, I'm using this green for. And because we've cut the sashing strips 2 inches wide, we're going to cut the little squares 2 inches square. So I've cut my strip of green, it's already 2 inches wide, and again it's folded over, it's double, and I'm going to cut, using the board for the help me with the measurements, I'm just going to cut along every 2 inches so that I get my squares ready. So I think you've got the hang of that now. So those are my little squares and those are my sashings. So I'll just quickly run through what I do next. So first of all, I've got all my pile of squares, and I have done some ahead, so I'll show you those, but I'll just work on the square here so you can see what I do. So I've got my square and my piece of sashing, and I usually work to a system. I usually put the sashing strip on the left hand side of my block, and I'm going to do this onto all of my squares, or if they were blocks. So I'm going to sew that with a 1/4 inch seam down one side, which will end up being the left hand side as I look at it. So just my 1/4 inch seam, and generally I would be doing quite a few, but I'm just going to work on one to show you, but I would just chain piece those through because it's the same thing for all of the squares now. So I'm just going to press that seam. So I'd have them all joined on, and then I could take them all to the iron and I could press them. And because I'm working with white, I want to press that seam in towards the colour so that it's least obvious. There will be occasions when you can't help having the seam showing under the white, but overall it won't be a problem. So I've got my sashing strip on one side on my left, and I would do that, as I said, with all of my squares. So I've just prepared a few ahead here. So these would all be done, and when you lay them together you can see that you've got this nice strip in between. Now you could join all these up into a row and then you have to make a narrow strip, but I don't really want to do that. I'm going to now attach to all of the rest of my sashing strips, which I'll have worked out how many I need. I'm going to attach one of my sashing posts to one end of each of those now. So first of all, you don't attach your posts, you put them onto your bigger square. Then you attach your post to all the rest of the strips, just to one end. So we'll just do a couple of these. Same thing, I would chain piece these through, just your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And continuing on with those. And I would press those, and again I'll press them into the seam into the colour, because it's a nicer way to do it, and it also will allow the seams to just sit snugly together when you come to put the next bit on. So just press that seam just into the colour. Okay, so what I would do now is I would attach one of those strips to the bottom side. So I've already got my strip on the left hand side of my square, and now I'm going to attach one of these strips with the sashing post onto the bottom there. And you'll see, because you've pressed those seams both into the colour, that seam will just snugly butt together. So I'm just going to sew that now with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this is quite a fun way to use up some of these delightful squares. Sometimes you don't want to cut them up, they're too nice. It also makes a fairly quick quilt if you're looking for a quilt fairly quickly, as sometimes we do. Okay, so now I've attached that onto there, and I'll just take that to the iron, and again I'm going to press it mostly towards the colour. At this stage a little bit of the seam will be under the white, but that just can't be helped. So I've done all my squares with one strip on them, and then I'm going to put this next strip on the bottom of all my squares. So I've just done a few here so you can see how we're coming together now. So you can see they're going to get joined together as squares rather than long skinny strips of the sashing and posts. So continuing on doing all the blocks like that, but we're still, when we've joined them all up for a quilt, we're still going to find that we've got to join on some sashing around the outside. That's because I have sashed completely around all the squares rather than leaving the outside without sashing. So having got all our squares in this form where we've got the sashing on two sides and one post, I would now come along, and for all the ones that are up the side of my quilt, I'll be putting another sashing and post onto the side. So leaving the top row, we'll do those ones in a minute. So coming up the side row, we'll pop this one on here. I hope this is all making sense. It's really quite straightforward when you go to do it. And I found it just makes it much easier than having to join up lots of rows of skinny bits. So I'm just going to press another one. Okay, so now we've got all these ones, and I've just done some ahead again so that you can see coming up the side here. You can see now that that's becoming quite complete in the way it looks by bringing that on the edge there, and it's just all joins up nicely. Then we've still got the top row. So the top row is very much like the side row. You're going to be joining another patch on. Oops, we better come this way a little bit. Right, bring all these down. So to go along the top edge now, because we've worked out how to do this, we're going to join another one of our strips along the top of each block. And so you're getting the hang of it now. So we've got the three sides on. So the side blocks and the top blocks actually look the same. If you've got a one-way fabric, you might want to keep an eye on which way they're going. But otherwise, that's the same process. So we've started off doing just the one side, then we put the two sides on. Now we've got three sides on just for the top and the side, not for the majority of the blocks. Most of your blocks in there, you won't be doing that too. Now we've then got one small problem at the end. We've got to work out how to get this last square on the end. So one piece of your sashing, sorry, you've done them all this way with one post on. The very last one has a post on both ends. So we'll pop one on the end here. And that just finishes off that last corner. Okay, press that seam in towards the colour. And that's going to go on the last square. So the very last block, I've got my sashing ready with the post on the end. So this is the very last block. It's going to be the last one in the top corner, but it needs to have a little sashing post up there. So I'm going to sew that last one on. So this is the only block that has, the only square that has the sashing all the way around it is the very last one that you put in. So I'll just press that, and then you'd be ready to join up your rows of all your squares. So you can see when you place that one in there, that just completes it. Now presumably you would, well, quite likely you would have more squares. It would be a bigger quilt, but we started off, we just put the strip on the one side, then we put the post onto the strip like this, and then we pop that onto the bottom side. So I work on the left side, then coming along and doing it along the bottom side, and then for the side row we put one up the other side, and for the top row we've placed one along the top, and the very last square we've got one on that side and there, but we've got the extra square sewn onto the sashing there. So, and then they're quite manageable. Now you can just join up your rows of squares rather than having these long skinny strips to place between rows, which I've always found quite hard to manage. And by popping the sashing post in, you get all your corners nice and everything matches. If you don't put the post in and you just have really long strips, there's the opportunity for things to manoeuvre a bit, and things won't be lined up in just the same way. Of course, quite possible, but this is just a fun way of doing it. Sometimes when I don't want another colour in the posts, I might even still put the sashing post in, but in the same fabric as my sashing. So it won't really show when it's all quilted and everything, but it just helps me keep everything lined up, which I quite like to do. So I have made a quilt, or a couple of quilts using this method, so I thought I might quickly show you those. So I have made the quilt from this pattern that I showed you, and it's just here behind me. And these are obviously much darker colours, but still quite delightful. And it's just the 5-inch squares done with the sashing, just the way I've shown you. And then I've got another quilt the same, but a much, much larger quilt. And done all in delicious blues. So you can get an idea of just using one colour, but variations of it. And all the sashing and the border are the same, and this time with the little sashing posts I have used a little stripe, and I've used it on the binding as well. And so I have kept my stripe, it's only a little stripe that's in those posts, all going the same way. So that would be just something to keep an eye out for if you were using a one-way fabric in there somewhere. So hopefully that will help somebody use up some of their 5-inch squares, or maybe you don't need to use them up, you just want to use them. So a great idea for quick sashing, and a delightful quilt at the end. Thank you.